Hello, everyone. Welcome again to another Q&A for our fall screening series. My name is Camelia Shofani, and I'm the Senior Manager of Public Programs and Events here at the International Documentary Association. For our visually impaired attendees, I have dark curly hair, light skin, and brown eyes, and I'm wearing a black t-shirt. I want to thank you for joining us for a conversation around the documentary Punch 9 for Harold Washington, moderated by Tim Cogshell with director Joe Winston and producer Raymond Lambert. I'd also like to thank our ASL interpreters Lavender and Jimika and our CART provider Eugene. Thank you very much. For more information on our screening series lineup and Q&As, please visit documentary.org/screening-series. Before we get started, I'd like to offer a brief land acknowledgement. We recognize the Gabrielino Tongva as the past, present, and future caretakers of the land, water, and cultural resources of the unceded territory of Los Angeles. So with that, I'll hand it over to Tim. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Joe and Raymond, for this excellent documentary film. I'm super ridiculously excited about your movie for a couple of different reasons. It's an excellent movie. It's an excellent movie. And as a film critic for the last 35 years, I would be saying that no matter what. But as it happens, I'm a fella of about the correct age and from the right place for this film to have sat with me as if it was reading my own history. I'm from St. Louis with a whole bunch of family up in Chi-Town.
Okay.
Good. Up to Chicago, all the time, all through that period, 1983 in the early 80s. I'm 61 years old. So this was a period in my life when politics were becoming a thing. And the run for mayor of Harold Washington in 1983 resonated all the way through all of these Black communities all over the United States of America. And one of those communities was my actual Black community. Harold Washington was like Uncle Harold to us. And, you know, I'm from one of those Black families where they had Malcolm and Martin and, and Bobby Kennedy. And Harold almost made it on the wall. Harold almost made it on the wall. So your film, it would have been very easy to do a cradle to grave film, but you guys chose not to do that and to concentrate on this very specific period. Talk a little bit about that choice and why you made it. There's some very young Harold Washington in your movie, but talk a little bit about the choice to cover this period exactly.
Joe.
Yeah, I think I can take that. Hi, Tim. Thank you so much for the kind words about the film. And I'm looking forward to talking with you about this. So I'm the director of Punch 9. I'm the middle-aged white guy with silver hair and a black shirt at the top. And so I grew up in Chicago. I still live in Chicago. And I was a teenager when Harold Washington first ran for mayor in the 1980s. And I lived in the same neighborhood. He was somebody we would just see around, and several family friends went to work for his administration. So, Harold was a gigantic figure in Chicago. And so our decision to focus on his race for mayor and his victories as mayor of Chicago really came about because the genesis of this project for me, when I was smart enough to bring Raymond Lambert and other really talented producers and crew on board to make it a reality, the inspiration really came from the white backlash to the Obama presidency, because it was such a shock to so many well-meaning people, especially well-meaning white liberals. But to me, I totally expected it because I was like, come on, guys, don't you remember Harold Washington? So we approached Punch 9. Look, there are a lot of great biographies and great civil rights documentaries out there. And what we wanted to do with this one that's maybe a little different is we kind of constructed it as sort of an adventure story and a moral parable for Harold Washington as an amazing figure who's worthy of a movie. He's just fascinating. And also as somebody who blazed a trail that we can still follow.
Raymond, please.
So I had been working, I worked on Maya Angelou right before this, and that's where I met Joe and some projects. I'm not from Chicago. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I'm a middle-aged Black guy with no hair. How about So I'm from the Philadelphia area. So Wilson Goode was always like that Black mayor, or Maynard Jackson, or those folks. I was familiar, and I knew who Harold was, but not really knowing him. And I didn't want to do it until Joe sent me the material and said, well, hey, listen, take a look and let me know if it resonates with any of your friends or whoever might want to be involved. And when I saw it, I was so captivated by the man and his the charisma, but not only that, but how intelligent and smart. And also that Chicago was quite a bit different than any other mayoral race in the country at that particular time. So, and it was that really drew me in to say, this is a really interesting story, not to mention the Obama presidency. So that's sort of where I came on board.
Man, that connection that we
Yes.
see in the film back
Yes.
through Obama and Valerie and all of that's very sort of fortuitous or specific thing. If I can talk about a point of actual filmmaking for a second.
Sure.
The opening sequence of your film is just hot.
Thank you.
I mean, it's just hot. It's like thriller hot. You come in hot, you cut it up, and you give that entire history, a run of Chicago history, right up to Harold Washington's run, in that beautiful montage against that Stevie Wonder music. Talk a little bit about that opening montage of the film, which is just, I felt like I had almost taken a class just watching, and I think it's only about 3 minutes or something like that before you hit that title credit. Talk a little bit about putting that together.
You want to do it, Joe?
Sure. I mean, that was the editorial team, coming up with that and crafting it back and forth. I mean, yeah, the film opens with kind of a capsule history of mid-century Chicago racism. There's greatest hits from Mayor Richard J. Daley and the riots at the '68 conventions and other things that were happening in Chicago at that time, what the city looked like, what it felt like in the turmoil of the 1960s. It's just a bit of background that you really ought to have to understand the 1980s, right? When Black, civil rights becomes Black power, becomes Black empowerment through elections. And we just tried to give it to people. Look, history has a bad reputation, right? So we make movies because they're fun. So we wanted to have some fun with it and rope you in and wake everybody up. And I tried this even with my kids who were 11 and 13 at the time and hate documentaries. And they were completely riveted. And they said, Dad, this is the least boring documentary I've ever seen.
Exactly. And we've had, what's interesting too about that for me is we've got a great title company. One of the things we tried to do with this film too was use all the talent that exists in the city of Chicago in filmmaking, and we tend to get overlooked sometimes. And Sarosky was that we sort of partnered with in doing this, and it was like, it's amazing. And if you know Stevie Wonder, we're looking for him too, by the way.
Yeah, so it's so invigorating, and it pulls you right into this period in Chicago history. Of course, Tom Bradley had been elected mayor in the early '70s here in Los Angeles. I'm coming from Los Angeles. I'm from St. Louis. Okay. St. Louis and Chicago had much more in common.
Sure.
Than the sort of liberal coalitions of Jewish people and Mexican Americans and Black folks and liberal white folks who put Tom Bradley in office, not nearly against the sort of pushback, the very, very bifurcated city of Chicago. Talk a little bit about the flat out, straight up, no kidding around, racist dynamic that existed in Chicago prior to, and frankly, even after Harold Washington got elected.
Joe, you're a Chicagoan. You probably want to address
Absolutely.
that.
I mean, well, Harold Washington's run for mayor in 1983 was quite remarkable. At that time, we had a Democratic primary and a general election. So once he became nominated as a Democrat, to the surprise of many in the city's establishment, his white Republican opponent adopted as his campaign slogan, "Before it's too late." And I remember that as a 15-year-old, and I was shocked and thought it was insane. But everybody in Chicago knew exactly what that meant. Listen, the thing that's important about Harold Washington at that time is that he brought 1 million Black people with him. He was not just going to put a Black face on the existing system. Harold Washington was about reform. He was going to change a corrupt way of doing business that was stymieing Chicago. And that's why his election was so important, and everybody knew it. I mean, the vitriol was high because the stakes were very high. He was going to turn over the chessboard and start everything anew.
I think one thing's interesting too about that perspective, or at least for me in telling the story, was it wasn't just the sort of this racist, segregated population. It was also Black folks. So that when he first, I think the first poll I saw, he was in third place amongst Black people, because it was just the idea that we don't know if we're quite ready for that. And if we lose, then what are the repercussions if this doesn't work out, which I think is a fascinating story.
You know, of course, which became a repeat story in 2006, 7, 8, 9.
Yes. Yes.
When all of this happened again on a larger scale with a guy named Obama, who's in this movie.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about many of the people who are in this movie: Valerie Jarrett and obviously Barack, and so many people, David Axelrod, Rahm Emanuel, who came to be figures on the national, the international media, but there at this moment, all sort of pivoting off of what Harold Washington was doing. Can you make some connections for me between what Harold was doing and these very important people who would come along?
Well, for me, I guess, and I was learning. Obviously, Joe lived it being here, but some of the connections were starting to be like sort of astonishing to me. The big one for me was Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition campaign in '84 and '88. And as I studied Harold Washington, I go, wait a second, that's Harold Washington's playbook. That's like exactly what it was. Or Eddie Murphy talking about Harold Washington in Raw, which that's pop culture. So I'm like, this is not just politics. This is actually reaching beyond it. And then obviously Valerie and Rahm and all those folks who were here and a part of his campaign. Joe, you probably can talk a little bit more about that. But we did. And the other thing too, I'll say this before Joe starts, is not only did we talk to his supporters, we also had the opportunity to talk to some of his opponents, who, by the way, are still his opponents, which is, I found to be quite interesting.
And I do want to talk about some of those guys that were still also, I should say, Democrats.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about that, if you would, for me, Joe, particularly being from Chicago. What the hell was up with the internecine politics of the Democratic Party in Chicago? And are they really that much different from the internecine Democratic politics, period? We really do seem to eat our own. And yes, I've given away that I'm a Democrat. Talk a little bit about what the hell was going on in Chicago, Joe.
Well, the Chicago that Harold Washington came into was a one-party state, as it were. I think there was one Republican alderman out of 50. Chicago has 50 city council members. I think Los Angeles doesn't have anywhere near that many, and it's now a larger city. So, you know, it was Democratic Party politics on the national scene, but locally it was machine politics, okay? So Harold's opponents were machine guys. They wanted to keep a system of patronage and corruption, you know, buying votes with favors, giving out jobs in exchange for votes. They wanted to keep that system of privileges going. And so that was why politicians opposed Harold Washington. They would have been happy with another Black guy who would continue to let them run their schemes, but Harold Washington was not that guy.
Talk a little bit, if you would, both of you guys, about the connection from 1983, and I guess we can walk all the way up to Mayor Lori Lightfoot, but it's not that straight of a line, is it? I mean, could you talk a little bit about the curves and bends that get us from there to here?
Joe, you want to?
Sure. I mean, you know, there was, I don't want to give away like the whole story of Punch 9, but of course, it doesn't surprise anyone. It's been 30 years that Washington is no longer with us, and he died tragically while in office. And that was an enormous blow to the Black community in Chicago. And it was a real blow to progressive reform too, in this city and possibly nationally, because I think if Harold Washington, he would regularly promise to his supporters, I'm going to be mayor for 20 years. And he was reflecting on the old Mayor Daley, who had in fact been mayor for 20 years. And so Harold's tenure was cut short just as he became powerful. It's a terrible tragedy and a terrible loss. And it did take a long time, it took a long time for the progressive movement in this town to recover. Progressivism nationally, I would argue, had a setback around that time in the late 80s. A lot of promising developments got kind of cut short. It took us a long time before Chicago would elect another Black mayor, and she's not even from Chicago. I mean, as you say, the connection is very tenuous at best.
Young Daley and all of that, Rahm Emanuel, all of whom ostensibly Democrats,
Yeah.
but not the same kind of politicians at all. The city of Chicago, Joe, if you don't mind telling me, what's the city of Chicago like now? What's the nature of things in Chicago? You too, Raymond. And how do you think they would have been different had Harold not been that black mayor way back so long ago? Which is kind of a tough question, but I think you know what I mean.
Yeah.
I'm going to roll, Raymond. Can I take this first?
Sure.
Okay. So Harold Washington rightly gets credit for reforming Chicago from a standpoint of racism and prejudice. You know, he was also the first mayor in this city to attend a gay pride parade, despite the fact that his opponents often spread rumors that he himself, a bachelor, was in fact gay when he wasn't. And in the 80s, that was a very toxic thing to say about a politician. You know, he was progressive. He was socially radically progressive, Harold Washington. But I think he should also get credit for modernizing the city. The old system was not only unfair, it was inefficient and bloated and corrupt. You know, Dick Mell, the alderman who opposed Harold Washington, told us a story about how the city would have 3 bridge tenders for every bridge that only required 2, and the third one could sleep or mess around. You know, I mean, it was a system that was not working. And I think that what Harold Washington did, besides reforming sort of the city's ethnic and racial prejudices and other prejudices, was he brought it into the future. And Chicago, as any visitor will tell you now, you know, is a very modern global city. And I think Harold Washington should get a lot of credit for that.
Mm-hmm. Raymond.
Yeah. And I think, you know, I guess because I've been here so long that I think the city gets a bad rap. And I think some of those reforms that he put into place are still evident. At the same time, I also think some of the machine politics, I mean, it's an entrenched thing. You know what I mean? If you think it's 100 years old, and unfortunately for us, he was only in office for 5 years versus a Maynard Jackson that's in Atlanta and he's in office for 20 years. And that makes a considerable difference as far as he was just getting started. But in that short period of time, the impact, we still feel it.
Yeah, it sort of rumbles through, including, and one of the things that's represented in the film, I think so beautifully, is the way he brought together some of those coalitions that we talked about. He was instrumental in getting Latinx members on that city council. Talk a little bit about that and what he did. The LGBTQ community, mostly I think Puerto Rican community, if I'm not mistaken, or at least it was back then. Talk about how he brought all that together.
What, Joe?
Well, Harold had a beautiful vision, you know, of unifying the city around liberal values. You know, he knew that he could beat the machine, which was these old corrupt white guys, basically running things anyway, with junior partnerships for whoever would go along with their schemes, that he could unify the city towards something better by bringing everybody in, you know. So he brought in Hispanics, right? The Mexican community, the Puerto Rican community. He brought in women who had been left out. He brought in LGBTQ people who had been left out and discriminated against. He knew that by the big tent, right? I mean, that was his philosophy. And it was a beautiful one. It was a winning one, because then once he was mayor and once all these people were included, the Washington administration could deliver. The administration could make people's lives better. And that made him very popular once he was reelected. And sadly, he died shortly afterwards.
Raymond.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it's interesting because I think about him in terms of like how politicians operate normally and even today, where I see where Harold would go where he wasn't particularly liked. And he had a very engaging way of saying, you know what, we have more in common than we have not in common. And whether you vote for me or not, I'm still going to work because I want the city to be a great place, and we're all going to be a part of it. That fairness, that idea about, you know, everybody's going to have a seat at the table. And, you know, politicians do talk about it all the time, but, you know, it's rare.
Let's talk a little bit about sources and methods. There's some wonderful, wonderful footage, archival footage of Harold. Obviously, Harold was in the news all the time once he was an adult. You have a few extraordinary moments of a ridiculously young Harold Washington, both on video and in still photography. Talk a little bit about that and how you went about the gathering together of all of this stuff to build such a densely made film? Whoever wants to start.
Joe can start there.
Well, that's one of the silver linings of the fact that, you know, independent grant funded documentaries take so long to make. We had a lot of time to dig through the archive. Chicago is blessed with some wonderful archives, a film archive, we have a radio TV archive, we have an independent video archive, and then all the news organizations and so forth. And we were lucky enough to find some individuals who had shot either film or tape at that time, some of which had to be restored. Roosevelt University, then college, where Harold Washington attended, was this sort of beautiful integrated institution in the 1940s that was very forward thinking and progressive. And Harold Washington, at however old he was, 18, 20 years old, he'd just come back from World War II as a veteran. He was a big star there. And that's where we found some black and white film of him and some photos of him. Ridiculously handsome as a young guy. He was a boxer and a runner, an athlete. He was involved in civil rights protests of the 40s. You're right that there's a lot that we don't dwell on about his early life. There is sort of a scarcity of materials there. There's much more of him once he's in politics, of course. But, you know, he was a remarkable guy, and he became mayor of Chicago at age 61, right? So here's somebody who's a crusader, you know, in the mold of, say, Alexander Ocasio-Cortez, but he's 61. He's been in politics for decades. He knows where all the bodies are buried and how it's done. He's a remarkable figure.
Mm.
Yeah.
Raymond.
Yeah, no, and you know, it's interesting because Joe, we would go back and forth on how much of his early childhood could you pack into it, because I think there's a whole nother film about his relationship with his father, who was an attorney in the 30s, Joe, or so, and a divorcee raising two boys. It's a really fascinating story, but it sort of shapes for me the idea that he's been in politics since he was 10 years old. His dad was a precinct captain. So he knows how this works, but he's, you know how they say, he's in it, but not of it. So, and I think that made him even more prepared for when that opportunity presented itself.
Well, let me ask, since you guys have done some deep research, where did Harold's progressive notions and inclinations come from? And what are they rooted? As you say, in '83, he was 61. Mm-hmm. So not a lot of 60-year-olds in '83 were LGBTQ, all of these sort of things. And so where did all that come from?
I think that really, from what we know, I think Harold's values, and particularly his progressive liberal values, were really crystallized during his college years at Roosevelt College, as I mentioned, because he was part of a really remarkable group of people. You know, it was integrated in the 1940s in Chicago. That was very rare, I think, of any big city college. And we got to talk to one of his classmates, his roommate, who's like 91 years old now. And there was a really remarkable, brilliant group of people there. And it kind of all started then. And then his resentment of machine politics, Harold's resentment, came through how they treated his father, who, you know, he and his father both started like at the bottom door knocking, what they call precinct captains here in Chicago for the machine. And I think Harold's father was up for some kind of office and got turned away. So he developed a resentment for the system based on that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Raymond.
And I think he was, you know, like you're saying, Joe, as he was in leadership positions in college and law school, I think he may have been the only, or it couldn't have been more than two Blacks in his class at Northwestern in law school, and he was one of the leaders in that at that. So he was sort of in leadership positions all the way along, and I think that sort of raised its head, sort of in the early '70s, where he's always been a progressive. So this wasn't new. You know what I mean? This is stuff he's been doing.
As we think about contemporary politics, present day politics, Kamala Harris, Barack Obama, Tashara Jones is the mayor of St. Louis, where I'm from, first Black female, and so on and so on and so on. We go through all of these kind of things. Where would you place, and again, Tom Bradley here and a few others around the country had been, but where would you place Harold's run for and successful capturing of the mayorship of Chicago, particularly Chicago, among all of these very important moments of firsts that we keep seeing? It seems to me to be very, very important because it seems to me that it was one of the more difficult.
Sure.
I'd like to pitch
that. Go ahead.
So I really think that Harold Washington's run for mayor and victory for mayor in Chicago in 1983 was momentous and really unique. You know, Tom Bradley was elected mayor of Los Angeles well before that, when the city was only 10% Black. And I think similarly, I don't know the exact racial makeup of New York City when David Dinkins was elected mayor a few years after Harold died. But again, it was the Black population is significant, but not even close to half. Chicago was 40% Black, 40% white, and 20% other, mostly Hispanic and Asian. So what Harold Washington was doing as a Black mayor was incredibly significant. He represented, like I said, more than 1 million people, and a seismic shift in the balance of power. It was not just a matter of white voters being willing to elect an individual, right? Which it's hard enough to get them to do that, right? Who's not white, to a position of power. But this individual represented a movement. Harold was drafted to run for mayor. Yeah. He didn't want to do it. He was a sitting US congressman at the time. He could have been a congressman forever, probably would have lived longer too. And, you know, he was drafted by a movement that represented a seismic change. And I would argue that Chicago in the 80s, as it was becoming racially pluralistic with no majority ethnic group, was facing then what America is going to be facing soon.
Raymond.
So, and for me, it was different in the sense that usually my experience had been, if it's a Black mayor, it only happens when either the city is majority Black or there has been white flight, like say Detroit with Coleman Young, and there's like nobody left, but you know, everybody's gone and they leave whatever the scraps are left. Here, it was like really entrenched, like, no, we're not going anywhere. And this guy's not going to be mayor. We're going to do everything in our power. And then we start to tell that story. And they tried, I mean, as you know from watching the film, at every step of the way.
Yeah, well, you look up, then X number of years later, when Mitch McConnell, you know, upon Barack Obama running, announces that we're going to make him a one-term, it echoed all the way across the decades. It just echoed. And then it was Barack Obama who, you know, seeing him as a young man standing there amidst all of these people in the happy story, it does sometimes make you feel like, Jesus Willikers, can we really change any of this? And then we have to remember that Harold won, you know, twice. Barack won twice.
Yes.
Yet here we are. And if you don't mind, guys, and you don't have to spread your politics all over the place here, but if you don't mind talking a little bit about all of that period and the politics of then, and where we are now and the politics of now, and what we might be able to take from these two moments in history.
Well, I can tell you, for me, you know, I don't consider myself a political animal. Joe is much more astute that way. The big word for me that I've taken away from studying Harold is courage, and the idea that I'm willing to put it all on the line for what I believe in and what I think is right. And as you know, I think it may kill me, but in order to get this done, and I feel like now we're missing that piece that says, I'm going to do whatever it takes to see that everybody has a seat at the table. That may mean I may lose the next election, but I'm going to go in here and I'm going to fight, and I'm going to go hard, and let's see what happens. And I think we're missing that. I don't feel that same kind of energy that we got from that, but maybe I'm being emotional, but I just don't feel it.
Joe.
Harold's courage comes across, I think, in Punch 9, and he was truly a remarkable figure. And as Raymond points out, it did kill him, you know. But I think the other thing that's really special, and why we have so many different voices in this movie, there's a remarkable number of interview subjects. It was quite a job in the edit room juggling them to make it all comprehensible, is because Harold was buoyed by a movement. He wasn't just one person, not just you need great leadership, but that leader needs a movement underneath them and behind them to carry them through. So everybody knew from the beginning of his campaign what and who Harold stood for and what he planned to do, you know? So that was crucial, and he depended on that, you know, and his movement, you know, entered the city council, so the lower branches of government as well. And that's what it takes. You know, I think that we liberals have a tendency towards a bit of a messiah complex. We want one person to come along and save us.
Yes.
And Harold did not come along to save anybody. He was drafted by a vibrant movement, a diverse movement of civil rights groups all over the city who'd been active for years. I mean, the 60s never stopped in Chicago. These people just turned to neighborhood level activism. And when they were ready, and it took a long time, they found the right political talent to be the tip of the spear. Okay. And that was Harold Washington.
Extraordinary. Punch 9 for Harold. Punch 9 for Harold, and it sort of talks about what that is with the thing. Explain exactly what the punching in the night. Work it out for everybody.
And that was fascinating to me as well, because what would happen in races in Chicago, and we've seen it happen all over the country, is that the powers that be would run a candidate with a name similar to yours. So they would run Harvey Washington or Harold Wilson, and hope that you weren't paying attention when you.
There's an Eddie Murphy movie with that exact thing. Go I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. You know what I mean? And you're not paying attention. You may press the wrong thing. And so the way around that was to identify with strict instructions, which were punch 9, it's all mine, or punch 9. You know, that was the way in which he gave instructions to avoid that.
I love that. Black politicians are always good at finding a bit of onomatopoeia.
Yes, you got to do it.
Jesse, that was just right. It's a wonderful film, very important. It's an education, but it's also an exciting film that I found invigorated me in the current political environment. It made me remember that, man, sometimes you can win. Sometimes they can be all against you. You can still win, and sometimes you can win again. and that was really exciting. It's what the film does. Excellent work, folks. My name's Tim Cogshell. So happy to be moderating this event for IDA. I'm an old Black man with pink hair and a pink beard, and I'm not even kidding. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Really appreciate that. Thank you so much.